All right, hello everybody. Welcome to our next lesson here. Today we're going to be talking about changes in post-World War II U.S. So our objectives and standards to explain opportunities that were available to African Americans following World War II, excuse me, and to understand the contributions of individuals to civil rights and culture. And take a moment there to read the standards, please. And our desired result: how did society and culture change for African Americans following World War II? So the return from war. Veterans returning home from fighting the war faced many difficulties. So to assist with these challenges, the U.S. government approved something called the GI Bill. Now the GI Bill was used to provide financial support, employment, training, and education for veterans. Now, African American veterans also took advantage of the GI Bill. Many of them are going to enroll in colleges, but donations are going to decrease with the post-war depression. After World War II, the country is going to struggle a little bit and go through a little bit of a depression, not like what we had seen before during the Great Depression, but times are going to be tough for people. Now, proposing a solution to this was a man from the Tuskegee Institute, and his name was Dr. Frederick D. Patterson. That's his picture there. That's a look of an older picture there of him with President Lyndon B. Johnson. But again, that's him there. And he's going to suggest that schools collectively appeal to the nation for donations. So in 1944, we have something called the United Negro. Again, that was the term that they used back then. The United Negro College Fund was created in April to give financial support to African Americans seeking higher education. So government takes on racism. Discrimination and racism are going to continue after World War II, but the government is going to take steps to combat it. In 1948, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981, which banned the segregation of the armed forces in the U.S. military. So prior to this, we had African American units, we had white units, but starting in 1948, we're going to see a mix between whites and African Americans in the military. Now, the military was slow to desegregate, but eventually in 1954, it was reported that the last African American unit had been disbanded. So again, we're going to see African Americans fighting alongside white soldiers, white sailors, and things like that. So fighting segregation. African American veterans were determined not to accept segregation and discrimination following World War II. So President Truman also banned discrimination in the hiring of federal employees in 1948. And then in the 1950s, that gentleman right there, President Dwight D. Eisenhower, also took steps to limit discrimination in hiring practices. Several states in the North and in the West also passed laws against segregation as well. However, despite some advances, many opportunities are going to remain closed to African Americans in the 1950s. So resistance by whites. During the 1950s, whites witnessed a time of economic prosperity while many African Americans are going to struggle. Now, resistance to equality for African Americans was also prominent, especially in the South. There were unfair laws, violence, and fear were used to keep African Americans from equal rights. Laws and customs kept African Americans separated in jobs, schools, housing, and other areas. Excuse me. So they were separated in all these areas, like I said, jobs, schools, housing, and other areas. So African Americans were forced to use segregated areas such as bathrooms, water fountains, movie theaters, restaurants, and facilities under these Jim Crow laws. Now, following World War II, we're going to see new civil rights leaders decide to fight back against segregation in schools. So the struggle of school segregation. Under Jim Crow laws and segregation, African American schools were worse than white schools. They didn't have the proper books, they didn't have the newest things to use. So even though there were African American schools, a lot of times they were in worse condition than white schools. Now, back in the 1840s, we have Robert Morris, who's right here, and Charles Sumner. Both of these gentlemen worked to sue the city of Boston and claim that segregated schools violated the state constitution. Now, they did lose the case, but it set a principle that segregated schools are unequal. Now, Charles Hamilton Houston, he's right down here, he was the head of the NAACP, and he starts a campaign against segregation in the 1930s, and they are determined to chip away at this whole idea of the separate but equal. If you remember thinking back to Plessy versus Ferguson in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that the Supreme Court ruled that as long as African Americans had a facility, segregation was legal. Well, they're going to chip away at this idea, and they're going to hire Thurgood Marshall, this gentleman right here, as their chief legal counsel to fight back against segregation. So, separate but equal challenged. The NAACP and its lawyers won a series of court cases. Now, a very important one was a victory against the University of Missouri in the 1938 case, Gaines versus Canada. Now, this gentleman here, he is Lloyd L. Gaines. He was an African American who was refused admittance to law school at the University of Missouri because of his race, but the university said, oh, if you go to another school, we'll pay for you to go there to a law school. Well, the NAACP says, no, I don't think so. And eventually the case was won, and it stated that states have to provide equal educational facilities within their borders. So even if that meant an African American law school, they have to provide access to that. Now, this was a major victory, towards ending segregation in higher education, but unfortunately Gaines never attended, and he actually disappeared in Chicago, and sadly, it's presumed he was murdered, and the case remains unsolved to this day. Now, the battle of Brown versus Board of Education. In 1954, Thurgood Marshall went before the U.S. Supreme Court with a case that's going to change the entire country. Now, he stated over a 2-year period that segregated schools damaged student self-image. Now, the case was formerly known as Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. What happens here is when NAACP members tried to enroll their children in white neighborhood schools, they were refused and told to attend African American schools farther away. Well, this little girl and her parents, this little girl is Linda Brown. Actually, she just passed away about a year or so ago. Her parents take this case with the NAACP to the Supreme Court, and they say that that's not fair, that's not legal. Why should they have to send their daughter to a school further away just because it's an African American school when she could attend a white school that was closer? So what happens here is the Supreme Court does rule unanimously that separate but equal is unconstitutional, and that racial segregation in public schools is illegal. This is a picture, I believe, here of Linda Brown with her mother sitting on the Supreme Court steps in Washington, D.C. with a newspaper that says, High Court bans segregation in public schools. Now, a troubled start to school integration. Across the country, there were mixed results to the decision in Brown versus Board of Education. That's why there's a troubled start, to school integration. Now, white leaders were strongly opposed to school integration, and many pledged to block African Americans from attending white schools. Only 3 southern school districts had desegregated by the end of 1954, and the U.S. Supreme Court goes, hey, you guys need to pick up the pace here. So they ordered public schools to desegregate quickly, in 1955. Now, in many parts of the South, demonstrations took place against school integration, and finally, the federal government will have to take action in Little Rock, Arkansas. So, the Little Rock Nine. In the fall of 1957, the Little Rock Board allowed 9 African American students to attend the city's white Central High School. That's a picture of them up here with some of their supporters, so that's the 9 of them there. Now, when the students arrived for school, the governor of Arkansas ordered the Arkansas National Guard to prevent them from entering. An angry white crowd also met the students and threw foul language at them and harassed them. And one girl down here, Elizabeth Eckford, this is one of the most famous pictures in U.S. history, and I think even maybe world history. Elizabeth Eckford was 15 years old, and she arrived at the school alone, and she was surrounded by a hostile white crowd and was turned away by National Guard troops. Excuse me. Just imagine what this girl is being, all these things that people are saying to her. I mean, this woman here is clearly screaming probably something very rude and very offensive at her. And imagine, this girl's many of your age or around the same age as you. So imagine what that must have felt like for not just Elizabeth Eckford, but for these students trying to attend this school. Now, the federal government takes action. The Arkansas National Guard prevented the Little Rock Nine from entering the school for nearly 3 weeks, and eventually President Eisenhower has had enough, and he sends federal troops, meaning the U.S. Army, to end the tension and the standoff. So U.S. soldiers with fixed bayonets actually escorted the students with fixed bayonets into the school on September 25th, 1957. Now you might think, oh, that's, everything's going well. Well, they were still harassed and faced abuse from white students. But out of the group of the Little Rock Nine, 8 of the Little Rock Nine remained at the school. And in May 1958, Ernest Green became the first African American to graduate from the school. So again, we'll begin to see a lot of changes now in school integration and things like that. All right. So how did society and culture change for African Americans following World War II? Think about the GI Bill. Think about the struggle against racism and segregation. Think about the fight against school segregation and some of the victories they had there in terms of that. And that'll help you answer your question. Hope you have a great rest of your day or night. Please let me know of any questions or concerns, and I hope to talk to you all soon. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.